All right. Welcome, everyone, to our History Hour. Tonight, we are going to be learning about Grassmere Cottage in Sorrento and the story of Isaac and Lee Gwynn Lawrence and the first wedding at the Church of the Redeemer. And Sam Younger, our Sorrento historian, is going to present for us tonight. So, Sam, take it away.
Oh, here I am. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sam Younger. I've been summering in Sorrento my entire life and have been doing lots of Sorrento history for about 10 years. And I'd like to do lots of history that has been somewhat forgotten over the years. And I'll also make a plug for Sorrento Sullivan, the Sullivan Sorrento Historical Society. If you're not a member, think about joining. We now have an online membership uh, where you can join online. So let's get started with our little forgotten history about Sorrento. Uh, there was a great book written by Catherine O'Clair Herson called Sorrento, a Well-Kept Secret, that many of you probably know about. And she included two cottages that once stood side by side on the road leading down to the West Cove boatyard. And she labeled the first cottage Rock End and the other Lookout Cottage. And the cottage that's pictured on this slide is the only one that's standing on the hill today. And many people are familiar with it. In 1998, Bob and Wendy Worrell purchased it from Doris Parr. And in recent years, they've carried out extensive renovations on the cottage. Mrs. Parr acquired the house in the spring of 1965 from the town of Sorrento after a vote was taken at a town meeting. But the Worrells have now renamed this house West Cove. In Catherine Herson's book, she repeats the much loved story that Frank Jones built this cottage for his mistress, Delana Curtis. And she also relates that a local YWCA later used the house for a camp before it was donated to the town. And while the story about the cottage being used by the Y as a camp is true, I'm sorry to tell you that unfortunately the much loved story about the cottage originally being built by Frank Jones as a gift for his mistress is not exactly true. Jones and his mistress do appear in the history of the house in later years, but that story about that scandal will wait for another night, maybe. Tonight, I want to focus instead on the early history of the cottage and its first owners, who were named Isaac Lawrence and his wife, Lee Gwynn Lawrence. I'll also go into the story about the wedding, a wedding the couple hosted in June of 1891, which was likely the very first ceremony held in the newly built Church of the Redeemer in Sorrento. The Lawrences' connection to Sorrento, as well as the painful story surrounding the couple who were married there in 1891, all seem to have been long forgotten. In the spring of 1892, African-American journalist and social reformer Ida B. Wells was forced to flee Memphis, Tennessee, after the office where she published a local newspaper was destroyed by a mob of white men. This attack had been sparked by a series of groundbreaking stories she had written about assaults against Blacks in the South and her calls for Blacks to leave the city and move to safer states. And just briefly, if you're watching the HBO series The Gilded Age, the character of Peggy Scott, the Black journalist, was based partially on Ida B. Wells, and both the character in the series and Wells in real life worked for a publisher of a New York paper named Thomas Fortune. Since this is Black History Month, it's fitting that Ida B. Wells fits into the story. I'm not going to do an in-depth history of her, but if you're interested in her, I would recommend to all of you to learn a little bit more about her remarkable life. So when the attack occurred against her offices in Memphis, she was actually on a lecture tour on the East Coast, and sensing that it was unsafe to ever return to Tennessee, she decided to move to New York City to continue her career. And she focused her writings and lectures on documenting the many horrible assaults that were occurring around the country against Blacks, and speaking out in particular about the lynching of Black men accused of raping white women. As she explained to her readers, she wanted to make the point that, quote, the Afro-American race is more sinned against than sinning. And in October of 1892, Ida B. Wells collected her writings into her first book published by the New York Age to document what she called the Southern horrors and the lynchings. In her second chapter entitled The Black and White of It, she included examples of attacks against African American men involved in seemingly consensual relationships with white women, interactions that Wells writes spurred Southern white men in insatiate fury to wreak their vengeance without intervention of law against Afro-Americans who consort with their women. At the end of the chapter, she points out the double standard that no such outrage was expressed in America when Black women are attacked by white men. And she provided several examples of those assaults, including an attempted rape that had occurred only a few months earlier in Memphis that involved a local white businessman named Ellerton Dorr. Surprisingly, 1 year earlier, the perpetrator of that attack had been the bridegroom at a hastily called ceremony in Sorrento, Maine. Before I explain how Ellerton Dorr ended up in Sorrento in 1891, let me give you a quick history of how Sorrento came to be. Before the summer resort was established, the Waukegan Neck section of Sullivan was best known as the home, as we all know, of Daniel Sullivan. The town had recently seen some economic booms. The first was a fish oil boom in the 1860s, and then came a silver and copper mining boom in the 1870s. Both of those had ended quickly, and life along the Maine coast was never easy, especially for the local farmers who owned large lots of land on the point. And while the local economy may have been in tough shape, a local Ellsworth American correspondent visited Sullivan in December of 1883. He couldn't help to notice the wonderful views on his drive around the point. Along the 6 miles of roads, he observed, such picturesque scenery is hardly to be found anywhere on the coast of Maine. And when that visitor encountered a local farmer, their conversation is telling and explains why many families might agree to sell their farms in the next few years. You have a very beautiful location here, he says to the farmer, and to which the man replied, well, perhaps, I really do not know. To me, it's a matter of very little consequence whether the situation is beautiful or not. Why, the reporter asked, you do not appreciate the beautiful? The farmer then gave out a well thought out and philosophical answer. No, I don't believe I do. I used to think I could see the beautiful. And after telling the visitor about his many travels around the world and his return to what he believed was the most beautiful place of all, he went on to say that the constant care, toil, and drudgery of the farm had just taken it out of him. Beautiful scenery, he concluded, is not for the wealthy, is only for the wealthy, not for the laborer. 2 years later, the story of Sorrento would begin in Sullivan Harbor. That's where the Frenchman's Bay and Mount Desert Island Land and Water Company was founded in 1885. And by 1886, the company had purchased the Waukegan House at the head of the harbor where Dunbar's is located today. And the men who owned the operation then turned their attention to buying a couple of local farms on Waukegan Neck, where they hoped to establish a new summer resort. the leading force behind the founding of Sorrento was not what many people believe. Frank Jones was believed to be the founder of Sorrento. He really wasn't, but it was another man, Charles Lewis. Lewis was a native of Alton near Bangor, and Lewis had a very interesting life. He trained as an engineer. He had served in the Union Army during the Civil War and served oh, sorry, during the Civil War. After the war, he moved west to search for gold in an operation funded by Thomas Edison. He then moved to New York City, where he worked as a stockbroker on Wall Street with Jay Gould. He came to Sullivan during the mining booms of the 1870s, and he backed silver mines there. And he had another unsuccessful real estate venture in Stockton Springs called the Cape Jellison Land Company. But by 1886, his vision was to establish a new summer resort uh, that were popping up along the coast. He wanted to take on places like Northeast Harbor and Bar Harbor and Hancock Point. He was entirely responsible for hiring the designers, promoting the venture, and even naming the resort. Over the winter of 1886, he made his first land purchase. He bought 86 acres on the eastern side of Waukegan Neck from Captain Elijah Doan for $4,000. And this purchase also included what we now know as Treasure Island, although not any of the rights to the gold found there. If you listen to my presentation from last year, Elijah Doan had also leased out the mining rights to the mine that I spoke about last year, the Boss of the Bay mine. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the reporter may have interviewed Captain Doan. He had purchased the land in 1855 from the Bean family after a career traveling the world. He was 68 years old at the time that Lewis bought the land from Captain Doan. Later that spring, Lewis bought the land near the harbor that was previously owned by the Bean family. At that point, it was owned by a collection of Bean relatives. Nancy Bean and her daughter, Louisa Uran, had originally sold their family farm to a man named John Mason from Bangor and William Hill of Boston, who was the owner of the largest steamship company that plied the New England coast, the Boston and Bangor Steamship Company. And it was rumored that Hill had been planning to sell lots for summer homes on the land. But Lewis came in and offered him a $50,000 offer to buy the land. And I guess it's an offer that was too good to refuse. Lewis not only had a dream, but also the funds to invest in the major development. His first order of business was to hire a landscape architect named Herman Grundle to design and plan his new resort. Notice that Grundle made street plans down on Bean Point. And while Grundle may have been a visionary, he was not a practical surveyor. And instead, they hired a local gentleman named Gilbert Simpson. The Simpson family is very prominent in Sullivan, and Gilbert Simpson laid out the street lots for Sorrento. Lots that are, his plans are still in use today. And to promote the new resort, Lewis opened a sales office on Milk Street in Boston and placed one of his first ads in March of 1886. Notice that it's referred to as Sorrento in quotes, and it's called Point Harbor. Point Harbor is the original name for the harbor, not Sorrento Harbor. That would take several more years to make the charts. In that first summer of 1886, Lewis sold about 16 or 17 lots of land. He also issued stock in 1887 to finance the construction of new roads and a wharf and steamer, and as well as to build a few houses. The stock offering was evidently successful, and shares nearly doubled in a few months. By the summer of 1887, it was reported that although the stock price had fallen to 7.5 cents per share, and things were going so well that the stockholders would be paid an 8% dividend, a new slate of directors would also be joining the company. And this is the point where Frank Jones becomes involved in the Sorrento resort. And these new investors would oversee more improvements, including the construction of a 150-room hotel located on the harbor during the winter of 1888. How and why Jones got involved is unknown. He was the largest ale brewer at the time in the United States. He was an influential Democratic politician. He had served in Congress in that important 1887 period. But Jones also had many other business interests in the New England, including his hotels in Portsmouth. And more importantly, he was the owner of the Boston and Maine Railroad, which had a terminal in Hancock Point. The history of Jones needs its own lecture at some point. So to market the new resort, in the fall of 1887, Lewis commissioned a Bangor company to send an artist to town to illustrate a bird's eye view. And prominently featured at the top of the drawing was the steamship he had purchased, the steamship Sorrento, that would bring potential buyers over on excursions from Bar Harbor. Also seen in the illustration is the cafe that the company was planning to open near the wharf. And in 1887, Lewis attracted a Boston architect named Frank Hill Smith to Sorrento, where he planned to build 2 cottages of his own design on several lots of land that he had purchased. The 2 cottages he built were featured in the bird's eye and can be seen to the left of the cafe. And shortly after the lithograph was published, 2 families, the Cochrans and the Lamonts, would each buy one of the cottages, and they would eventually name them Tasseltop and Blueberry Lodge, which are names that stick today. The buyer of one of the Frank Hill Smith cottages in 1887 was Eva Smith Cochran, and she would have become an important figure in Sorrento's history. Eva was the heir to the Alexander Smith Carpet Company in Yonkers, at the time one of the largest carpet manufacturers in the United States. They employed over 3,500 workers at a carpet factory in Yonkers. And that summer of 1887, Eva likely took one of the steamers over from Bar Harbor to visit the new town. And by September, she had taken ownership of a cottage. And I'll just point out, in lots of the purchases that were done in those early years, there are lots of women who made those purchases of land and cottages. And not surprisingly, Eva Cochran was the heir to a large fortune. She had the funds to buy the land. The Cochrans already owned a large cottage in Bar Harbor. It was designed in 1882 by a noted Boston architect named William Ralph Emerson. But Eva and her family came to prefer life in Sorrento, and in 1890, they sold their Bar Harbor cottage to a man from Philadelphia. That cottage actually, there are no pictures remaining. He tore the cottage down, replaced it, but his replacement cottage you can still see along shore path in Bar Harbor. And members of the Cochran family, as we all know, still summer in Sorrento. And Mrs. Cochran is important to our story tonight because it was her expression of commitment to her new town that in 1889, before she had even sold her Bar Harbor home, that she funded the construction of another important structure in Sorrento, and that is the Summer Chapel, the Church of the Redeemer. The January 1881 morning edition of the Portland Press reported that 5 houses were under construction at Sorrento and that business is quite lively and the outlook for the place very promising. The article went on to say that 2 of the new cottages already had new owners, Eva Cochran of Yonkers and Isaac Lawrence of New York City. The house that Lawrence bought was located at the top of the hill where today the Route 185 intersection meets the streets that go down to the harbor. Lawrence was a New York City attorney and purchased the house with his wife, Lee Gwynn Lawrence, and their deed indicates that it was financed with a mortgage from the land company of about $4,700. Lawrence at the time was 60 years old. He had been born in 1828. He was a son of the one-time Democratic governor of Rhode Island, William Beach Lawrence. His father had a distinguished career in New York City. He was a law partner of Hamilton Fish. He had relocated to Rhode Island, where he also became the lieutenant governor and eventually succeeded to the governorship. During his term, he successfully fought laws to abolish the debtors' prisons and more famously helped to defeat Rhode Island prohibition laws. He was eventually defeated, the father, but like his father, Isaac inherited an interest in politics. And in 1878, he also ran for governor of Rhode Island. But like his father before him, his campaign as the state's Democratic Party nominee was unsuccessful. And within a few years, he had moved back to New York City to practice law. A few years after returning to New York, Isaac Lawrence, then a 55-year-old bachelor, met and married the much younger 26-year-old Lee Gwynn in 1883. 30 years his junior, Lee was the daughter of Nicholas Gwynn, a native of Tennessee and a wealthy New York cotton broker of the firm of Fielding and Gwynn. There was a large cotton brokerage in New York City at the time. In July of 1888, the Bar Harbor Record published a long article on the new resort across the bay, and it described the beauty of Sorrento and the many improvements happening there. Also reported were the names of the people who had purchased new cottages, including one bought by the Lawrences. And the report described the couple as enjoying the beauties of Sorrento and the pleasures of a rural life. On the next page of the Bar Harbor Record were the weekly cottage listings for the vicinity, and the Lawrences were the first to have a listing in Sorrento at their newly named Grassmere cottage. Later that same month, the Kennebec Journal reported that nearly $10,000 worth of oil paintings of the choicest character had been hung in the new Lawrence residence at Sorrento. The article also described the stained glass in the tower at Grassmere, finished in all the vivid colorings of the rainbow. You can see a floor plan to the left that shows Grassmere was not really particularly large. There was a dining room and a sitting room and a kitchen and what was probably a servant's room on the first floor. And on the second floor, a bathroom, as well as a large bedroom and 2 smaller rooms labeled as chambers, as well as the tower room. Over the following winter of 1889, the land company that controlled Sorrento began constructing several more cottages, including one for its president, Frank Jones, which is along the harbor. Also built that winter was a larger cottage next door to Grassmere, and in the spring of 1890, the Bar Harbor Record reported that Isaac Lawrence had purchased that second cottage as well. And like many houses of the era in Sorrento, uh, these were not designed by architects. They were actually based on mail order plans, and the local builders would use those mail order plans and base their buildings around those plans. You can see on the lower left-hand side the plan from the Modern Houses Illustrated book that has the plans. After buying the second cottage, the Lawrences called their compound Grassmere, and on the facade of the foundation of their new house, the couple installed a granite marker that's still there today. They commissioned the Lawrence family crest carved on the slab and a Latin inscription that's translated to say, "I find." And directly beneath the crest are engraved the couple's initials and 1890, the year that they purchased the cottage. In 1973, Ted Van Winkle published a book called Frenchman's Bay that many of you may have. And in his book, he has an interesting theory about why Lawrence may have built the second house. And his story was that he had the house built for his wife, whose company he apparently found uncongenial. We'll never know if that was the real reason or whether the Lawrences just needed more room. So no doubt many weddings had been held on Waukee Neck before Sorrento was established, and many in the town of Sullivan. And the resort itself may have even had a few hosted in the years after it was founded, maybe at the hotel. But on a Thursday morning in late June of 1891, the first wedding that I can document being held at the Church of the Redeemer took place. Construction on the new church had finished late at the end of the previous summer, just in time for its consecration mass that was held on August 24th, 1890. And there are no reports of any weddings having taken place in 1890. This first wedding had been arranged by Lee Gwynn Lawrence, the owner of Grassmere, for her older sister, Elizabeth Gwynn Hancock, who would be marrying for the second time. Her sister Elizabeth had been left a widow when her first husband, Russell Hancock, had suddenly died 7 years earlier in 1884 at the age of 34 at the family's plantation in Clarksville, Mississippi. Lee's sister Elizabeth, the mother of 3 children, was only 31 at the time that Russell had died. Russell's father, Elizabeth's father-in-law, was U.S. Army Major General Winfield Scott Hancock. It's a very confusing family line. I'll try to go slowly. Winfield Scott Hancock was a prominent Civil War general, nicknamed the Thunderbolt of the Army of the Potomac. He'd been gravely wounded at Gettysburg while he helped to lead the Union's defense at what has become known as Pickett's Charge. After Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson ordered Hancock to personally oversee the execution of Lincoln's conspirators. And in 1880, General Hancock was chosen as a Democratic nominee for president. He lost that election to James Garfield. Following his defeat, General Hancock was asked to take command of the U.S. Army's division of the Atlantic stationed at Governor's Island in New York Harbor. And in 1885, after his son's premature death, the general invited his daughter-in-law, Elizabeth, to move with her young children from Mississippi to his house at the officers' quarters on Governor's Island in New York City. And it was there that the widowed Elizabeth met a young officer stationed on the island named William C. Rafferty. The general died the next year at the age of 62 while still posted on Governor's Island. Despite her father-in-law's death, Elizabeth continued to live either at the officers' quarters or in New York City with her parents, while her bond with Captain Rafferty seemed to deepen. Rafferty grew close to her children as well, and even began to tutor Elizabeth's oldest son, Gwynn Hancock. And in the spring of 1891, newspapers announced the engagement of Elizabeth to Captain Rafferty. So it's somewhat surprising that just a month later, a piece in the New York Times announced that a telegram had been sent from the Hotel Sorrento asking a local Episcopal priest in Bangor to make plans to come to Sorrento to officiate at a wedding at the new church later that week. Last-minute arrangements were also made for an organist and other musicians from Bangor to make the trip to Sorrento. And the article identified the bride as the widow of Russell Hancock, but curiously, the groom was not Captain Rafferty, the man she was reported to have been engaged to in May, but another man 10 years younger than her, Ellerton Dorr of Boston. And the New York Times also indicated that Boston papers were taken by surprise since they had anticipated that this wedding would take place there later that year. So it seems that the 38-year-old bride had hastily moved up the date of her ceremony and would hold it instead on a Thursday morning, a week before the 4th of July in Sorrento. In addition to the headlines about her breaking off her previous engagement to Rafferty, the newspapers also reported that Elizabeth had just come into a $2 million inheritance. Still mourning the death of her father, Nicholas Gwynn, and wearing black as was the custom, Elizabeth changed into a white gown and put on a collection of diamonds. And with no attendants and escorted only by her brother-in-law, Isaac Lawrence, she carried a single red rose as she walked down the aisle of the little summer chapel in Sorrento that had been decorated with native ferns and wildflowers. The 28-year-old groom, Ellerton Dorr, was the son of another wealthy cotton trader from Boston. Ellerton was accompanied by his younger brother, Alfred, and two friends as ushers and best men, and the wedding was sparsely attended. Only a few dozen people were there. One included General Stephen Vincent Benet, who had a home in Sorrento, which is now Pine Pillow, and everyone had an aisle seat to watch the ceremony. No members of the Hancock family or the groom's parents were in attendance. Following the ceremony, the wedding party and guests rode wagons up Lawrence Hill to Grassmere for a catered breakfast hosted by the bride's sister. And the Bar Harbor papers described the wedding as the very first held in the pretty little chapel. The paper also reported that the newlyweds would leave Sorrento later that day on the ferry to meet the train in Hancock for a trip back to Mississippi, where they would assume responsibilities of managing Elizabeth's family's cotton plantation. Surprisingly, Gwynn Hancock, the bride's son, returned to Governor's Island after the wedding, where he continued his studies under his mother's former fiance, Captain Rafferty. And Gwynn would go on to successfully pass his exams for West Point and was later commissioned as a captain in the U.S. Army. The Boston newspapers had fun reporting on the wedding, with one gossip columnist saying, "The news of the marriage will be a great surprise to the parents of the groom, who were out of the country at the time, and they'll never suspect that their son had selected a guardian for life." In addition to their age differences, news about the couple's finances were on everybody's lips. The column went on to say, possibly his wisdom was beyond his years, for the newly made Mrs. Dorr recently inherited over $1 million from her father. Curiously, instead of going right back to Mississippi, as was reported earlier, the couple returned to Sorrento after the wedding, and it was later reported they would spend the month of August in Maine. Early the next spring, in April of 1892, the newlyweds' only daughter, Elizabeth Ellerton Dorr, was born in Memphis. Her birth 9 months later may explain the hurried wedding the previous June. Disturbingly, only a month after their baby's birth, an Associated Press dispatch from Memphis, Tennessee, reported that the city was ringing about a sensation such as no precedent in this country. The headline said that an arrest warrant had been issued for a Memphis businessman, Ellerton Dorr, for assaulting and attempting to rape an African-American woman who worked as a cook in his neighbor's home. In her complaint, Maddie Cole, the woman he assaulted, indicated that Dorr was drunk at the time. At the time, Dorr was a prominent cotton trader on the local exchange and split his time living in the house next door to where Maddie worked in Memphis and on his family's plantation 75 miles south in Mississippi. Luckily for Maddie, before Dorr could finish the assault, her employer heard her screams and was able to chase Dorr away. He fled in his carriage, possibly back to Oakhurst, the plantation in Mississippi where his wife lived. After an investigation by a local DA, a grand jury failed to bring an indictment against the attacker. Instead, Maddie Cole chose to file a complaint with a criminal court judge who issued the arrest warrant for Dorr. Ellerton then fled the state to avoid prosecution, and the AP report indicated that this was the first time in American history that a Black woman had successfully pursued charges of attempted rape against a white man. Although they never divorced, it appears that Elizabeth and Ellerton, who had been married less than a year earlier in Sorrento, would never live together again after the crime. And as I noted earlier, African-American journalist Ida B. Wells included this assault in her work published in 1892. And as an example, that the Afro-American race is more sinned against than sinning. Incredibly, 6 years later, in April of 1898, there was a second Hancock-Dorr family wedding. This ceremony took place at the family's Mississippi plantation. The bride at this ceremony was Elizabeth's oldest daughter, Ada Elizabeth Hancock, now 24 years old. Ada was to marry her stepfather's brother, Alfred Dorr. Alfred had been one of his older brother's attendants at the wedding in Sorrento 7 years earlier. Evidently, Elizabeth did not protest and allowed her daughter to marry her disgraced husband's 32-year-old brother. Elizabeth Hancock Dorr, the bride at the wedding in Sorrento, lived until 1911, when she died at the age of 58 while visiting one of her other daughters in Memphis. Interestingly, Elizabeth is not buried with either her first husband in the Hancock family plot in St. Louis, or, not surprisingly, with her second husband, whom she married in Sorrento. Instead, she was buried by herself under a simple granite cross in her native Kentucky, far from the Mississippi plantation and Memphis. When another of her daughters, Myra, died just 4 years later at the age of 38, she chose to be buried next to her mother under the sculpture of a resting dog. As for the groom, Ellerton Dorr, he wasted no time in finding new companionship. Only 1 week after Elizabeth died, Ellerton married a 22-year-old telephone operator on May 13th, 1911. Only 48 years old at the time, Ellerton never faced any legal consequences for the assault and attempted rape of Maddie Cole in 1892. Ellerton lived in Boston until the age of 80 and died in 1943, while his new wife outlived him for another 21 years. A year after Elizabeth died, tragedy struck the family again. Their son, Captain Gwynn Hancock, who had been tutored on Governor's Island, died in December of 1912 at the age of 32, evidently from the effects of alcoholism and perhaps a broken heart. There's a very complicated story of things that were going on the base at that time. And 2 months earlier, his wife had committed suicide at the Fort Constitution in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he had served as a commander. As to Isaac and Lee Lawrence, their vacations in Sorrento abruptly ended only 2 years after her sister's 1891 wedding. In the fall of 1892, William H. Lawrence, no relation to Isaac, who was the manager of Sorrento, reported in his notes that he had written a letter to the Bar Harbor Bank and Trust Company regarding a debt of $275. He had signed off on the loan for the couple and was now left holding the debt. And he indicated that he had written to Mrs. Lawrence to ask her to repay him the funds. We'll probably never know whether it was some financial dispute with the company or some other more personal issues that drove the couple to suddenly abandon Sorrento, but it's pretty clear that the manager had had enough of Mrs. Lawrence. He said in his notes that there is nothing she could do or say to injure me for the past 6 months that she has not done. And while the country was beginning to feel the effects of a serious economic depression in 1893, the Lawrences were not destitute and seemingly had no reason to leave Sorrento with an unpaid note to the land company. Both were fairly wealthy, although Isaac Lawrence, his estate had been tied up in a lengthy court battle in New York City. But they did abandon Sorrento. They left a trail of debts, and the Lawrence family instead relocated across the bay to Bar Harbor for the summer of 1893, where the local papers described Mrs. Lawrence as leaving, quote, life of pastoral delight among her cows and chickens in Sorrento to once again take part in Vanity Fair in Bar Harbor. Identified by the reporter as only 24 years old, Lee was in actuality closer to 36 at the time. Two years after the Lawrences left for Bar Harbor, the newly established town of Sorrento included those properties on a list of owners in default due to unpaid taxes. And the notice published in the local papers in 1895 lists their past due amount as $49 and provides a warning that if not paid, the land and the improvements would be sold at auction at the Sullivan Village Post Office in December. An article in September of 1895, however, reported that Mrs. Lawrence had disposed of the former properties in Sorrento, and they were now owned by Frank Jones. I can't find any deeds that related to that transfer. However, I have located other documents that Jones sold the property to another party several years later. And it's this next chapter in the history of the house that I won't cover tonight that involves Frank Jones's mistress, Delana Curtis. While Lee and Isaac lived for many years after they left Sorrento, tragedy seemed to follow them as well. In 1905, their 18-year-old daughter, also named Gwynn, lots of Gwynns in the family, drowned while visiting friends in Maryland. And in 1917, their son William was forced to take his parents to court, charging that the taxes on a New York City townhouse that they owned, as well as another family property on Broadway, had gone unpaid. Isaac Lawrence continued to live in New York City until he died in 1919 at the age of 90. His wife Lee would live another 27 years after his death. She died in 1946 at the age of 88. And the couple are buried alongside his ancestors in the Lawrence Family Cemetery in what is now Astoria in Queens, New York, which was then Long Island. After Frank Jones acquired the Grassmere properties, the house at the top of the hill was expanded and renamed Lookout Cottage. This renovation added a large 3-story annex on the rear of the house. However, Lookout Cottage seems to have fallen into disrepair at some point, and probably after 1925, it was demolished. After Frank Jones died in 1902, several investors bought both cottages. And since the large hotel on the harbor had burned by this time, they converted the cottages into hotels in an attempt to attract visitors to Sorrento in the 1920s. As I mentioned, the history of Frank Jones's mistress and her connection to the house is a story for another night, maybe next year for next Valentine's Day. This is a picture of West Cove today, and that ends my little presentation.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's amazing how deep the history goes into such a small area of land. And these families, especially the Lawrences, they did have very interesting lives and unfortunately sad ends. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions from folks. If you have any, you
Sure,
can
if anybody
just
has a question, I'd be happy.
thing in the chat. I was going to mention you mentioned the fire in Bar Harbor and that in Sorrento, that there had been no fire, so the hotel was able to be successful. And I was wondering, that was probably true. Do you know if Sorrento had any sort of boom after the fires that took place in Eden over on Mount Desert Island? Because um, there were no such fires on the Sorrento side. And
Well, that's what's interesting is, so Frank Jones died in I think 1902 or 1903, and he had a very, very complicated estate. Uh, his mistress was one complication of the estate, but he had lots and lots of properties and lots of businesses, and Sorrento was not mentioned in his will, interestingly. His other hotels were all mentioned in his will, and he wanted those to continue. And Sorrento was not mentioned in his will, and his family stuck around for a number of years. But the company that he controlled that owned the land in Sorrento owned the big hotel by the harbor. It was, at that point, it had been expanded to about 150 or 200 rooms. And they sold it to a couple of men from Boston, I think in around 1906 or 1907. And promptly, a few months after the deed transferred, the hotel burned to the ground. Uh, and I think that's probably the only large fire that I know about in Sorrento. That was in 1906 or 1907. and that's when Sorrento sort of went on its downward path as a resort. Bar Harbor continued to thrive through the 1900s, and the houses that were all built there were very successful in a social scene. And the big fire in Bar Harbor was what, 1947 or so.
Mhm. Yep, 47. And yeah, it's a gorgeous house. I'm glad that it's still standing. And there were some connections with the Lawrence family that you spoke about last year. Remember the tale of the of Gwynn drowning, which was a very sad news, tragic to die as a teenager. And
Right.
see,
I
we
see
have a
my
few.
brother has his hand raised. Go ahead, Dana.
Hey, Sam, that was great. Um, just a couple of quick questions. One, I had always heard that there was a second hotel in Sorrento after the famous one down by the harbor with the tennis courts near where the Welch's cottages are now, was located. Um, does the West Cove Grassmere cottage conversion, was that the only other hotel in Sorrento, or was there a second hotel? Because I seem to remember hearing a lot of stories about the second hotel. And then the other question was, you mentioned briefly at the beginning about Doris Parr acquiring the cottage from the town of Sorrento, and I have vivid memories that our father wrote one of his books in the tower of the cottage when it was still referred to, I think, as the Sorrento Community House in the early 60s. So is there any more relevant history of when it was owned by the town of Sorrento that you can share? I don't want to steal your thunder if that's all part of a future lecture. So those are my questions. Thanks.
Sam, you're muted.
Uh, Sorry, I believe in the 1930s the town acquired, and I put back this slide. I hope you can see it, Dana. This is the only other Hotel Sorrento that I can find, and that was uh, in the 1920s. And remember, Hotel Sorrento was put up for sale in 1926. So it was sometime after that land auction that the town of Sorrento took over the property. And actually, the funds. One of the stories is that Dr. Averill, who built Crowcrest, was the owner, but I can't find any deeds that transfer it directly to Dr. Averill. Instead, what I suspect is he put up the funds for the town to buy this from whoever owned it at that time, from the local developers. And I suspect at that point that the other house, the lookout house at the top of the hill, at that point that house was taken down, probably in the 1930s sometime. And then the town owned it. They leased it, as I said, to the local YWCA for a few years. And at that point, it was owned by a Northeast Harbor man who owned lots of the land in Sorrento. And he suddenly died in around 1935, 1936. And it was his estate that then sold it to the town of Sorrento in the 1930s. So from around the mid 1930s or so until 1965, it was owned by the town of Sorrento and used, as you said, for lots of purposes. I'm not quite sure what all purposes they used it for, but the town owned it, would use it as a community center. And in 1965, that's when the town uh, decommissioned it and sold it to Doris Parr.
There's a question in the chat from DJ, and she asks, do you know what happened to the stained glass windows?
No clue. We'll have to take a look around town and see.
Yeah,
Lots of
sounds.
people say that houses were taken down. I know some people say that they have pieces of furniture from the hotel. Who knows whether that's from the original hotel? I've seen stories that they actually moved furniture from the Waukegan house. The Waukegan house started to sort of deteriorate for years and years, and they moved furnishings from the Waukegan house down to the big hotel in Sorrento Harbor from the Waukegan house at some point. But I suspect most of what was in the Waukegan house what was in the Sorrento Hotel burned in 1906 when it burned to the ground. And if anybody has things that they think came from the Sorrento Hotel, I suspect it comes from this house and not from the old Sorrento Hotel. But who knows? But the point is, DJ, that houses were taken apart, and just like people use doors and windows and reconstruct them in new houses, a lot of that was done in local construction also, I think. And so it's very possible those stained glass windows are in someone else's house. I know Steve Sargent, who grew up in Sorrento, told me that his family's house in Sorrento was put together but with lots of used parts from other houses.
And that also reminds me of the house I grew up in Eastport had stained glass windows in the front parlor that had been saved from a church that burned down in the 1880s. So they did definitely save things and make use of them. Let's see, any other questions? So Daphne says, thank you for that in-depth story. Little did I know about all of that history. So many things to weave together. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for sharing the story of this house. And we thank you, Sam,
All right.
for your wonderful presentation tonight. Very timely for Valentine's Day with all of the coupling and romances and weddings. So thank you all for attending tonight. We will have a recording of this on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days for anyone not able to make it. And we hope to see you at next month's History Hour. Okay. Thank you and good night.
Thank you all.
Good night.